Hi, everybody. Billy Obenauer here. Thanks for joining me for today's lesson. In today's lesson, we're going to continue our series on Bateman and Konopowski's management textbook by moving forward into Chapter 4, Ethics and Corporate Responsibility. So, with that, let's get ethical. As we move through this lesson, we're going to start by describing how different ethical perspectives can help to guide managerial decision making. Then we're going to move forward and talk about some of the ethics related issues and laws facing managers. Then we're going to look at how managers can influence their ethics environment, outline processes for making ethical decisions, summarize some of the important issues surrounding corporate social responsibility, and then finally we'll wrap up talking about the growing importance of managing our natural environment. Now, before you get started, I want you to think about why ethical decision making is really important to managers. All right, it's probably pretty easy to sit back and think, well, yeah, CEOs and top executives have to make decisions where ethics are important, but I'm going to be an entry level manager or a middle manager, and that's not really going to matter to me. Well, I disagree with that. All right, so I want to give you an example here, and I want you to think about this to help illustrate why ethics are important to managers at all levels. All right, so imagine you're working for a company where you get monthly bonuses based upon your location's sales figures. If you hit your quota, you get a $500 bonus. If you get a high quota, you get $750 bonus. And if you hit a super quota, the highest target that you have, you'll get a $1,000 bonus. Now, your employees also get bonuses. Their bonuses are a little bit lower than yours. Your boss also gets a bonus. Their bonus is going to be a little bit higher than yours. But that's basically what the bonus structure looks like. All right, so it's the last day of the month. You've already hit your super quota, so you can't get a higher bonus than you already have. And your boss tells you that you have to send out your deliveries as scheduled, but your boss wants you to hold the invoices till tomorrow, meaning don't invoice the customers till tomorrow. Now, this is something that is against the company rules. You know this is against company policy. But the reason that your boss wants you to do this is that you're not going to benefit in terms of your bonuses from invoicing these orders, but if you invoice them the next month, they can count towards your bonus the next month. All right. Again, you know this is against company policy. The question is, what do you do here? Well, some of you might be thinking, hey, it's against company policy. I'm not doing it. It doesn't matter. Some of you might be thinking, hey, my boss told me to do it. I'm going to do it. Well, how do you make this decision? Okay, so I want you to start by thinking about who's going to be impacted by your decision. Okay, if you choose to hold the invoices and not invoice them till the next month, then that really only benefits anybody if you weren't going to earn a bonus, but these sales help you earn a bonus. Okay, now if that's the case, it's kind of like you stole your bonus. All right, so that could be wage theft there. Another thing that happens is as you push these invoices out and you delay the invoicing process, the customer does not have to pay their bill in the same amount of time. So you're giving them another month to pay their bill in some cases. All right? That means your company has to finance that. All right? So those are a couple of negative outcomes there. Well, let's look at what an even worse outcome might potentially be. All right. So this really happened. And the day that it happened, I told my boss, I said, under no circumstances am I doing this. Okay. I'm not doing it. It's against company policy. I looked at it and I said, look, for a $500 bonus, it's not worth me risking my job. I was young. I had two kids. There was no way I was going to take that risk. Okay. But my boss relieved me of my dispatching duties that day. He said, I'll take care of sending the trucks out. You take care of other parts of the business. You're no longer involved in this. Okay. Now, I knew what he was going to do. I opted not to report him at that point in time. Maybe I should have. Maybe I shouldn't have. Okay. But I opted not to at that point in time. I went on with my day. Okay. There were several invoices that did not get rung out on that day, including one for over $40,000. All right. Now, the assumption was that my boss who sent these trucks out was going to run these invoices the next day. Okay. But a month and a half later, we had a little bit of an inventory issue. We had an inventory shortage, couldn't figure out where that shortage came from. I dug into it and I found out that we had an inventory shortage because all these invoices that got held way back when never got wrung out. Okay. So our company could have lost over $40,000 there if I hadn't caught that, all because someone decided to break one of the company's rules. All right, so we went ahead and we invoiced this material, and most of the customers paid their bills, but one didn't. And it happened to be the person with the $40,000 invoice. Okay? They didn't pay their bill the first month it was due. The next month they paid every invoice that they had except for one. And the reason they didn't pay it was they said, I didn't get any material that month, so I don't think this is my invoice. Now, after a lot of discussions, my salesperson was able to convince them that that was their material and that the invoice had been delayed by accident and they did pay their bill. But for a while, it looked like we were going to lose over $40,000. Like our company was going to lose over $40,000. All right. And several people were a little bit concerned about what was going to happen to them as a result, myself included, because I was concerned that I should have probably reported this issue when I knew it was happening in the beginning. So now that we've established why ethics are important, let's just make sure we're clear on the definition. So our ethics refer to the moral principles and standards that guide the behavior of an individual or a group. And we know that unethical behavior happens in a lot of places, which is why it's so important that we are prepared for how we're going to deal with ethical dilemmas in the workplace. Now, managers can find themselves in a lot of situations where they may be engaging in unethical behavior without even realizing it. All right. So Cantor identified a phenomenon that she called homosocial reproduction. And this is a situation where people tend to hire and promote others who are like them. Okay, and that obviously discounts people for reasons that are not relevant to the job. Okay, people often think they're immune to conflicts of interest. So we see this sometimes with people who do research and also engage in consulting. Sometimes they might find that results of their research are maybe in conflict with what they're doing in their consulting work, and that creates a conflict of interest. Now, very few people actually recognize that that conflict of interest exists, which is why this can be so problematic. All right, people often take more credit for things than they deserve, or they might blame others when they deserve some blame themselves. Now, sometimes it's not even blaming others. Sometimes it's just not removing the blame from others. So I can think about a time. I've got a little drawing over here on the left of a quad and a dirty towel. I remember being a teenager and going to my friend's house and riding quads, and we got all muddy because we're out in the fields and the fields are kicking mud on us. And we got cleaned up when we were done, went into the bathrooms, washed up. Well, I wiped my hands on a towel that I didn't realize we weren't supposed to touch. It was his sister's towel. She was very upset that there was some mud on her towel. Okay, and when she said something, my friend's dad got extremely furious with his little brother because he assumed his little brother had done it. And his face turned red. He was screaming. And I swear, I almost feel like the hair on the back of his neck could have been standing up, right? I was scared out of my mind watching this man as he was getting mad. But the truth of the matter is, I didn't say a darn thing. I let my friend's little brother take all the blame when I should have stood up and said, "Hey, I'm sorry about that, Mr. R. That was me." Okay, now we've all probably had situations like that we can relate to. Well, how does this relate to the workplace? Okay, when I was managing, one point in time, I had an employee who hit a sprinkler head with a forklift. Okay, and if you've ever seen that type of thing happen, basically what it does is sets off the entire sprinkler system. Okay, we had tens of thousands of dollars of product that we lost. Ended up being reimbursed by insurance, but we did lose that product temporarily. We had to evacuate our building, shut down the business for hours until the fire department cleared us, and so on and so forth. Well, if we look at this situation, what ended up happening is the employee who hit the sprinkler head lost their job. Okay. But if we were to break this situation down and look at why did this happen? Well, this happened because years ago, years prior to me being in this business, somebody had modified racking in a way that it shouldn't have been modified. And then people had started storing product in a way that shouldn't have been stored. Now, for years, this went by. Nobody ever noticed it. Nobody ever said anything. We happened to have a big corporate visit that day, and a corporate safety person pointed out this issue. and said this needs to be fixed immediately. So I asked one of my managers to get somebody to take care of it. They went and got somebody who was pretty new on a machine. They got this new person on a machine who was very nervous to see corporate people there, and they were not in a great shape to be doing this work. Now the product was stacked very close to the sprinkler head, to the point that this new machine operator really only had probably 4 to 6 inches to work with in moving product. Okay, they misestimated where they could move it, and we had the accident. Well, I guess I would raise a few places here where we could look at blame. Perhaps, the level of urgency should not have been put on fixing this issue that was, because this issue had been there for years. Okay, that's part of it. Some blame goes back to the first person who modified the racking. Some blame goes back to the person who put the product in there so close to the sprinkler head. Some blame probably goes to me for just quickly delegating this to my assistant manager without giving them more specific instructions about making sure that they had, a good machine operator there. Some blame probably goes to my assistant manager for getting somebody who was going to be too nervous and not experienced enough to do this job. But ultimately, only one person had blame fall on them, and that was the machine operator. So, what defines an ethical issue? Well, an ethical issue is a situation where our values are in conflict. If we go back to the previous slide, if I had done the right thing and stood up and told my friend's dad that I got the towel dirty, that would have helped my friend's brother, but it would have hurt me. So, my values of wanting to do the right thing by his brother were in conflict with my values of wanting to do the right thing by myself. Okay. In business, we might have situations where we have to make decisions that help one employee but hurt another employee. One ethical issue that I had to deal with at one point in time is I had some employees who were being underpaid, and when I brought this to HR, they told me that I could only fix it through regular cycle raises, which meant when people got their annual cost of living wage increases, that was how I had to address this. So basically, in order for me to address some of my employees who were being underpaid and get them up to the point where they should be paid, I had to give less money to other employees. That created an ethical issue or an ethical dilemma for me, because my values of taking care of all of my employees were in conflict. I couldn't take care of some employees without harming others. Now, our moral philosophy refers to the values that guide our decision making. Okay. And often our moral philosophy is grounded in what we call major ethical systems. So here we have listed some examples: universalism, egoism, utilitarianism, relativism, and virtue ethics. Now, these are just some examples of major ethical systems. This is not an exhaustive list, but what we're going to do here in the next couple slides is we're going to go through these so you have a little bit of an understanding of what some of these ethical systems look like. The first ethical perspective we'll talk about is universalism. Okay, and this basically says that we should have certain values that we uphold in order to function. So, stealing is wrong, or be kind to others. And aligned with that, we have the principles for business, which are kiosi, living and working together for the common good, and human dignity, concerns for the value of each person as an end, in other words, as our goal, not as a means, or not as something that happens to happen on our way to our goal. Okay. Now, along the lines of universalism, you may have heard of something called Kant's categorical imperative. And what Kant said basically was that we have to do what's right no matter what the consequences. So we set our ethical rules and we follow them no matter what we think the outcome may be. And I often refer to Kant's categorical imperative as the Superman rule. And the reason I call it the Superman rule is because Superman had a strict moral code that he lived by in the comics. Okay, and one of his rules was Superman did not kill. And Superman could have Darkseid, who's one of the worst villains out there. He could have Darkseid cornered. He could have the opportunity to kill him. But because he does not kill, he would not kill Darkseid, even if that meant Darkseid was going to escape and get away and destroy another planet. Okay, so that's an example of universalism. It's also a pretty good example of Kant's categorical imperative. Next, we have egoism. Egoism basically says that people should do what is right in order to achieve their own self interests and that everything else will kind of fall into place. Okay, market forces will drive things to work out so that we get the best interest for everybody by all looking out for our own best interest. But there are a lot of critics of egoism. And for example, I would tell you to think about a crowded movie theater. Imagine you're in a crowded movie theater and there's a fire. Okay, the best thing that we can do for everyone is to get up and walk out in an orderly fashion, no pushing, no shoving. People take turns getting out and we go out very calmly. That's our best chance to get everybody out of that situation. But what happens in reality is people do look out for their best interest and they don't worry about others and they push and they shove and they trample and that results in fewer people getting out safely. Okay? So when we think about egoism, although there may be some cases where you think, hey, if I'm doing what's in my best interest, if I'm trying to achieve the largest bonus that I can, my employees are going to achieve the largest bonuses they can, and so on and so forth. But there are also a lot of cases where egoism can lead to negative outcomes for other people. Now, I'd like to introduce utilitarianism through the lens of the trolley car dilemma. Okay, and what the trolley car dilemma asks us to do, it's a thought experiment, and it asks us to imagine that we are working on the rails of a trolley car. Okay, so we see this big trolley car over here in the front, and the tracks of the trolley car are directed towards five people who are working on them. Okay, there is no way we can get these people out of the way of the trolley car, all right, and there's no way that we can break the trolley car before it gets to them. Right now, the way everything is situated, that trolley car is lined up and it's going to hit these five people. Okay, but you're over here on the side where I put this X, and you are operating the tracks, and you have the opportunity to divert the tracks. Okay, and if you divert the tracks, they're going to go over in this direction, hitting one bystander. Okay, so right now we have the trolley car is ready to hit five people, but you could divert the trolley car so that it only hits one. Well, what do you do? Now, if we're thinking about the greatest good for the greatest number of people, often people will say, yeah, I would divert the car. Okay. Some people say they wouldn't divert the car because they're going to let nature take its course. Others say, yes, I would divert the car so I hurt the lowest number of people. Okay. Now we throw a little spin on that. All right. What if this person over here that you're going to divert the car to is someone who you really care about? Okay. Think about whether it's a spouse, a parent, a sibling, a friend. That person over there is someone you really care about. Would you divert the car to save five people if it meant you were going to have to send the car towards someone you care about? And most people at that point say, well, no, at that point, I'm not going to send the car over there. So, what we found is we start to move away from doing the greatest good for the greatest number of people because of the condition, because the condition that doing so would hurt someone we love. Okay, now we throw another spin on the trolley car and we say, on the trolley car dilemma, we say instead of there being someone over here on the side, you are actually up here on top of this bridge. Okay, and up on top of this bridge, you see what's happening with the trolley car that is going to hit these five people, and there is no way to divert the car. It can't brake. We can't get the people moved, but there is a person next to you. Okay, so you're here, and then there's a person next to you, a rather large person, and maybe you're an engineer, so you know that this person who's up on the bridge with you is large enough that if you were to push them off the bridge, they would slow the trolley car down to the point that it would stop before it got to the five people. Well, do you push the person off the bridge? And now at this point, most people will say, no, I'm not going to deliberately push a person off the bridge. That's unethical. It's not my responsibility. But as we go through all these different scenarios, what we find is where most people will start saying, yes, I'm going to try to do the greatest good for the greatest number of people. As we change the conditions, their answers often change. So again, the utilitarianism perspective basically says that we're going to do the greatest good for the greatest number of people. And what we find is that people often agree with this perspective until we start changing the scenario. And as we change the conditions, people's perspective on utilitarianism often can change. Moral relativism basically states that we're going to base our morality in part on the behavior and opinions of those around us. Okay, and where relativism comes into place in business is that sometimes we change locations or we change cultures, and we need to be able to adapt to our new environments. So I had a friend who built his career in North Jersey, and in North Jersey there was a certain expectation for how people handled petty cash, and quite candidly it was a rather loose expectation. He got promoted with the company, moved out to Western New York, where the expectations around how petty cash was handled were a little bit different. He continued to conduct business the way he had conducted it in North Jersey. This raised some concerns amongst some of his subordinates, who actually called an ethics hotline and reported him, and he was relieved of his duties within only a few weeks in position. Now, had my friend engaged in moral relativism as he moved from North Jersey to Western New York, he would have better understood the opinions and the behaviors of people around him, and he would have adapted to that environment. Virtue ethics is based upon the concept that people mature in their morality. So, as people mature, they're going to behave in a more ethical manner. All right. And to conceptualize what virtue ethics looks like, Kohlberg developed a model for cognitive moral development. According to Kohlberg's model, there are three stages. The first stage, the pre conventional stage, is where you basically make decisions based upon your own immediate self interest. Okay, so the example we have here is a person just taking office supplies home from work because they need the office supplies and they're not worried about the morality of it. Okay, the second stage would be the conventional stage, right? And in this stage, this is where people make decisions based upon what the rules are around them and what the expectations are. So maybe you think about taking office supplies, but you don't do it because you don't want somebody to see you, you don't want to get caught, so on and so forth. Then the final stage is the principled stage. And this is where you make decisions based upon your own ethics. Okay, so you don't take office supplies from work because you think it's wrong. It doesn't matter whether or not you would get caught. You think it's wrong, so you're not going to do it. Now, according to Kohlberg, people can live in any one of these three stages. So some people will make it to the principled stage in their life. Others will only make it to the conventional stage, and some people will never get beyond the pre conventional stage. Now that we've talked a little bit about where ethics come from, let's talk a little bit more about why they matter. Well, part of why they matter in the workplace is that there's a perception that business leaders will do whatever it takes to get ahead, whether or not what they want to do is legal or ethical. And this has actually led to an erosion in respect for business leaders. Another thing that we have to recognize is that if ethical behavior is unrestrained, it can spread and create a toxic work environment. And what we mean by that is that as one person behaves unethically, another person behaves unethically, and another person behaves unethically. And before we know it, we have an environment where unethical behavior is rampant. In the workplace, we often deal with complex ethical issues such as brands and how organizations market themselves, CEO pay, and the discrepancy between highly paid CEOs and poorly paid employees, commercialism in schools. How do we give back to our communities without branding things in front of children in educational environment? Religion at work. How can we embrace being accepting of religion in the workplace while still keeping spirituality and work separate? All right. Sweatshops. How do we make sure that our clothes and our goods are being manufactured in a way that we think is ethical? And then wages in general, in terms of providing equity for our employees. Sometimes these ethical issues result in new laws being passed. So, for example, the Sarbanes-Oxley Act was passed in response to some issues at Enron, an energy company. And this happened around the turn of the century, where basically Enron was using some questionable accounting and reporting practices to make the company look more profitable than it actually was. And this led to a loss of wealth for a lot of people. So the Sarbanes-Oxley Act went into place and basically said that organizations that were publicly traded had to follow standard accounting practices, and it set guidelines for how they could report their figures, and it made executives accountable for how all this work was done. And part of the reason that laws like the Sarbanes-Oxley Act are necessary is because ethical climates vary from organization to organization. All right. And an ethical climate is basically the process within an organization by how we make our decisions and where do our morals play a role in this. And some organizations have very strong ethical climates where ethics play an important role in what they do. And other organizations look to bend the rules and bend ethical standards a little more than others. In terms of an ethical climate, there are several danger signs that there's more that we can do to improve our ethical climate. All right, so example would be excessive emphasis on short-term revenues over long-term revenues. So if we go back to the first example that I talked about, monthly bonuses were the focus there as opposed to long-term gains. All right. Then we have a failure to establish a written code of ethics. At that company, we actually didn't have a written code of ethics that I was aware of for another 2 years beyond the incident that I described to you. Then we could have a desire for a simple, quick fix solution to ethical problems. So when we talked about moral relativism, I talked about a friend of mine who got fired because of an ethical issue. Well, when he got fired, that issue was considered done. There were no investigations into, why did that happen in the first place? That was a simple, quick fix. All right. Then number four, we have an unwillingness to take an ethical stand that may impose financial costs. So maybe you care about doing the right thing for the environment, but you don't implement ethical guidelines that are environmentally friendly because they're too expensive. Number five, viewing ethics solely as a legal issue or a public relations tool. All right, so sometimes you'll hear in organizations, well, yeah, maybe it's not great, but it's not against the law. All right, number six, a lack of clear procedures for handling ethical problems. All right, so in that opening example, when I knew there was an ethical issue, I wasn't 100% sure what I should do at that point in time because the procedures weren't clear to me. All right. And number seven, a response to the demands of shareholders at the expense of other constituencies. And what this means basically is think about an organization where you're maybe not as profitable as you could be, and shareholders are upset about that. So you lay off employees, you make cuts to try to become more profitable, and you're not worried about the people who are impacted by these decisions. Now, in order to have an ethical culture and ethical climate, you need to have an ethical leader. And when I think of ethical leaders, nobody comes to mind before Dan Price, the CEO of Gravity Payments. Gravity Payments is a credit card processing company, and you may recognize Dan Price if you follow him on Twitter because he is definitely a person who is active out there talking about business practices that he thinks need to change, things that need to be done to take care of employees. But Dan Price doesn't just call out other leaders and other organizations. He puts his money where his mouth is. Okay, years ago, Dan Price set a minimum wage within his company of $70,000 a year. And he set that minimum wage because he knew some of his employees were working two jobs to make ends meet, and he didn't believe that that was right. Okay, but it wasn't just because Gravity Payments was a profitable company that he was able to set this minimum wage. Dan Price actually took a substantial pay cut himself in order to be able to do this for his employees. Our leaders also play an important role in our ethical codes. Now, the Sarbanes Oxley Act does require public companies to disclose whether or not they've adopted a code of ethics for senior officers. Okay, and there are guidelines for what these code of ethics should include, but our leaders ultimately play a very important role as to how detailed those codes of ethics are and how well they're enforced. Our leaders also set the tone for whether we have compliance based ethics programs or integrity based ethics programs. And the difference basically is that when we're compliance based, we just want to make sure that we're following the rules. If we're integrity based, we're focused on our principles. Okay, so I'm going to give you an example here. Years ago, I worked for an organization. It was kind of in a part time ad hoc type of role, and I was part of their retirement program. All right. But when I left the organization, I found out that a lot of my funds in the retirement program didn't vest, which basically means the money that the company had given me wasn't money that I got to keep. Now, in the organization summary plan document, the reasons you would or wouldn't vest were clearly spelled out. And based upon the document, I 100% should not have vested. Okay. And when I look at that, the organization very easily could have said, "Hey, Billy, sorry about that, but here's the rules, and we're in compliance with our rules." Okay. And if they had done that, that would have indicated that they had a compliance based program. All right. But that's not what happened. Raised the question to human resource management. They did explain to me where they were coming from. And I said, "My gosh," I said, "I've been with this company for a long time." And I said, "That does not really seem to be aligned with the company's values." And they said, "You know what? Thanks for giving us that feedback. We'll get back to you." And then it turns out they got back to me very shortly after that, and they found a way to help me get those funds. Okay. And they did it because they believed that getting me those funds was consistent with their values. And even though they weren't legally required to, it was the right thing to do. And that's an example of an integrity based program. So, how do our leaders become ethical leaders? Well, maybe it starts with their education. Okay. And one of the places where this can come into play is in an MBA program, because people in MBA programs are typically trying to become business leaders. That's why they're in the program to begin with. And years ago at Harvard, they started something called the MBA Oath. Okay. And the MBA Oath was basically an ethical promise that people volunteered to make either before or after graduation. And now it's been embraced by over 300 institutions and more than 10,000 students. Now, when I first learned about the MBA Oath, I pulled up some information. I looked at it. You can see everybody who signed it. And I looked at the school that I teach at right now has had one person sign it. And the school that I got my MBA at has only had two people sign it. And I'm not one of them. So I took a look at that and I said, you know what? For starters, I need to go and sign this oath, but I also need to go and take some steps to make sure that people know that this oath is out there so that we can build a network of ethical managers. Now, sometimes in your career, you're going to work for an ethical manager and sometimes you're not. So, how are you going to make ethical decisions? Well, it starts with moral awareness. And moral awareness is really just looking at a problem and recognizing that there are ethical implications. All right, then you have moral judgment. And this is understanding really what's going to be defensible and what's not. What's a decision that ethically I can live with, and what's a decision that ethically I shouldn't want to make. And then moral character deals with the strength and persistence that you have to act in accordance with your beliefs, even when it's difficult. Okay, because that's the thing about ethics. If doing ethical things was easy, everyone would do it. But making ethical choices is often very challenging, and your moral character determines whether or not you're able to do that. A great tool when you have to make ethical decisions is Rawls' veil of ignorance. And what Rawls' veil of ignorance basically states is that we should make ethical decisions as if we don't know what our place in the decision is going to be. Okay, now ideally, we would make decisions without knowing our place. But if we can't do that, we have to at least try to pretend we don't know our place. So here's an example of using Rawls' veil of ignorance. All right, so maybe I ask the question, should I curve the first exam? Okay, and if I curve the exam, only 10% of my students can get a grade of an A, which means if you got a 92, but you're only in the top 20%, not in the top 10, that might get dropped down to a B. So 92 could turn into a B. All right. If I don't curve the exam, your grade is fixed, meaning that the top grade in the class could be a B. Okay, so you could get an 88 and have the top grade, and that stays a B. Okay, but if I had curved it, that 88 would have become an A. All right, so if I curve it, your grade could go up or down. If I don't curve it, your grade is fixed. Well, how people are going to respond to this typically is going to be based upon what they think their grade is. All right. So if you know you got a 95, then you're probably going to want it to be fixed because you're going to say, hey, I don't want to lose this 95. Okay. If you got an F, then you're probably going to say, hey, curve it because I can only get better. All right. So if I was to do this with Rawls' veil of ignorance, the best way that I could ask my students this question would be either before they got their grades on the exam or ideally before they took the exam and even had a feel for how they did. All right. Now, in business, we want to try to ask ourselves questions without necessarily knowing what our role in the outcome is. So we want to try to think about, well, okay, maybe I'm going to be the person who benefits from this. Maybe I'm going to be the person who's hurt by this. Let me think about this through both scenarios. And if I was looking at either outcome, what do I think the right thing to do is? That's working with Rawls' veil of ignorance. Now, as we resolve ethical problems, we want to understand the moral standards, identify and diagnose the problems, but very importantly, we need to generate and evaluate our alternatives and consider the impacts. So, who's going to benefit, who's going to be harmed, who can exercise their rights and who has no rights here. So, I want to give you an example of this. Years ago, I was in a little bit of a dispute with a business owner who wanted to put a commercial composting facility essentially in my backyard. Okay, and we were arguing at town meetings, and we were actually argued on the radio, and we argued in the newspaper, and there was a lot of pulling going back and forth in a lot of different places, and it clearly was going to be a difficult issue to resolve. So I reached out to him and I said, look, how would you feel about sitting down and just having a conversation where I got to understand your side of this, you got to understand my side of this, and we can try to see if there's any common ground, any way we can work moving forward. So we did that. And what the business owner told me was, he said basically, I own this land, there's not many things I can do with it. This is something that I thought could work here. What would you do with the land if you were me? And I gave him some ideas of things that he could do that the local landowners around the property wouldn't be upset by. And then I said, well, look, can I tell you what I'm upset by here? And he said, sure. And I said, I'm upset by, these are the negative impacts that could impact those of us who live around this area. And he said, I understand that you think that, but I don't think those impacts are going to exist. And I said, I get that you don't think those impacts are going to be there. I said, but here's the problem. I said, if they are there, you're not going to buy our homes. We're not going to want to live there, but our property values are going to decline and we're not going to be able to sell our homes either. I said, so, if you were willing to write a contract with all of us who lived in the area and say, if we don't believe that the smell is tolerable, or we don't believe that the noise is tolerable, or so on and so forth, that you would buy our homes at what the fair market value was before you put in your facility. I said, I think we would be okay with this. But you're asking us to risk our livelihoods essentially so that your business can grow. And he looked at me and he said, I had never really thought and looked at it from that perspective. He called me a week later and he said, I pulled my permit applications. He said, I recognize, the perceived risk to your neighborhood, and I don't want to put you through that. And I found an area where the community is more receptive to this business coming in, and I'm going to go in that direction. And that's an example of that business owner saying, I'm going to take a look at what people's rights are, what the impacts are, and make my decision with that in mind. Now, everything that we just talked about in that example can really be summed up in this model here. So, we begin the process there by understanding the moral standards and recognizing the impacts. We take this information and we use it to define the whole problem. All right, once we've defined the whole problem, we look at the economic outcomes, the legal requirements, and evaluate the ethical duties, and use this information, this evaluation, to propose our moral solution. Now, I'd like you to engage in a thought exercise where you use that model to look at an ethical dilemma. In this dilemma, you're the CEO of a medium sized firm with plants in the United States and Taiwan. There's a shipment of critical parts held up indefinitely in Taiwan due to a paperwork issue. You learn that if a customs officer is paid what they call a facilitation fee, the shipment will be released. Without these parts, your operation is going to be shut down. As the CEO, what would you do? Now, as you got to step three in the evaluation process, you probably had to try to consider the legal ramifications. Well, the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act actually differentiates between what they call a grease payment and a bribe. And the difference here is pretty simple. All right, a grease payment is a payment that you make to officials outside the country to help speed along a process. So you're not changing an outcome. What's going to happen is going to happen either way. The grease payment just helps it happen faster. A bribe is a little bit different because what a bribe does is a bribe changes the outcome. Now, according to the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, grease payments are okay, they're legal, bribes are not. So, how do we know if our decisions actually ended up being ethical or unethical? Well, here's some criteria that you can use for evaluation. And these are really basically like benchmarks, good guideposts. They're not absolute rules. All right. The first one, my favorite, is you'd be proud to see the action widely reported in the newspaper. So, if you took away your employees' pension funds, would you want to see that on the front page of the New York Times? Probably not. And that's a pretty good indicator that that might be unethical. All right, it would build a sense of community amongst those involved. If it would, that's probably an ethical behavior. It's also probably ethical if it would generate the greatest social good. Okay. Would you be willing to see others take the same action when you might be the victim? So, would you want someone to take your pension? Probably not. And then last, it doesn't harm the least amongst us or interfere with the right of others to develop their skills to the fullest. Oh, this is a tough one. And what does this mean? Well, I used to work at a college where they started pulling away our research resources. So it's very important for faculty to research because it's critical to our ability as teachers, but it's also critical to us in terms of being able to find another job if we need one. Well, the schools started pulling all these resources away, and a lot of us actually left because we recognized that losing those resources was going to put our careers in jeopardy in the future. All right, so because of that, one might argue that pulling those resources away from us was actually an unethical behavior. And when our decisions are unethical, there are consequences, or at least there can be. All right. And the first level of consequence that we might see is paying fines and getting penalties from the government. We can also see lost time and lost money as we get involved in audits, legal defenses, and things of that nature. And then finally, unethical behavior can harm our reputation and cause us to lose customers. As we discussed before, making ethical decisions requires good moral character. All right. But when the right decisions aren't made, the Frank Dodd Act says that organizations have to have reporting systems that give their shareholders access to report ethical violations. Now, why do ethical violations occur? As we discussed, doing the right thing can also be really tough. Imagine this scenario: Pepsi Cola received a phone call from someone who worked at Coke, and the person from Coke was offering them trade secrets. They offered to sell them trade secrets. Gosh, if you were an executive for Pepsi, how much would you want to get the secret formula for Coke? Well, it's probably really hard to say no to that. But the executives at Pepsi Cola did the right thing. They reported the ethical violation and they didn't take the information, even though it was a very hard thing to do. Some organizations go beyond their legal obligations to society and they engage in fulfilling what they believe are their moral obligations to society. And when they do this, they're engaging in what we call corporate social responsibility. A great example of corporate social responsibility is Best Buy's teen tech centers. These are areas where Best Buy sets up tech that teenagers can use, teenagers who don't necessarily have access to this technology. So it gets them into a good, productive program. They're learning how to do different things. They're accessing tools that they wouldn't normally have the ability to access. And this is all through Best Buy's corporate social responsibility program. Some people have argued that there are varying levels of corporate social responsibility that businesses are obligated to engage in, and that these levels are organized somewhat like a pyramid where you have to meet one level of obligation and move on to the next. So at the bottom level, you would have your economic obligation, which basically means the business needs to be profitable. It needs to do what it has to do to stay around, because if the business doesn't stay around, it can't engage in any other levels of social responsibility. The next level would be the legal level. Okay, so we have to obey our local, state, and federal rules. The third level would be the ethical level, which is where you have to meet other societal expectations. So these aren't laws that we have to meet here, but maybe society expects you to do something for the community and so on and so forth. And then finally, you have additional behaviors and activities that society finds desirable and value, and the business supports them. And some ethics scholars have argued that if we want businesses to engage in corporate social responsibility, we need to move towards what they call transcendent education. Okay, and this is an education where we balance our self interest with our responsibility to others. And there are five higher goals that are outlined in a transcendent education. The first one is empathy, or seeing through the eyes of others who are impacted. Then we have generativity, learning how to give as well as take, mutuality, viewing success from a team perspective as opposed to an individual perspective. Civil aspiration. This is thinking in terms of what can we do for our community, not what do we have to keep from doing. Okay, and then finally we have intolerance of ineffective humanity, or speaking for those who need advocates. Now, as much as we're sitting here talking about how do we increase corporate social responsibility behaviors, we do have to answer the question of, do businesses really have a social responsibility? And those who subscribe to the shareholder model would say no, they don't. They would say the business's responsibility is to its investors, and they have a responsibility to increase profits so that they could increase the return to their shareholders. Okay, and some of the people that we've heard make arguments along this line are Adam Smith, who said capitalism has unintended positive consequences. He talked about the invisible hand. Then we have Milton Friedman, who says the social responsibility of a business is to increase its profits. And then, of course, we have Monty Burns from The Simpsons, who said he would donate $1 million when pigs fly. The counter to the shareholder model is the stakeholder model. And the stakeholder model basically says that organizations have responsibilities to improve the lives of those they interact with, whether or not that's necessarily profitable. But remember, improving the lives of others, engaging in the stakeholder model, doesn't necessarily have to be bad for your business. Okay, and think about organizations like Wells Fargo. So Wells Fargo is a financial company. They give out mortgages, all right, and they have what they call a forbearance plan for getting through temporary hardships. And this became fairly well known after a hurricane where Wells Fargo suspended payments for people who were impacted by the hurricane. Now, why would the organization do this? Yes, it's the right thing to do for their customers. Yes, it has positive impacts on the community, but it's also something that maybe has positive impacts for Wells Fargo. Not only is it good publicity, but if you think about it, if you're in an area where you get hit by a hurricane and you can't work and you're not earning and you can't pay your mortgage, well, what's going to happen? Maybe you're going to default on your mortgage. Well, what if Wells Fargo has a lot of mortgages in that area? Does Wells Fargo really want to foreclose on a bunch of homes that were just destroyed by hurricanes? Probably not. It's probably better for the business to give people a few months to get back on their feet, let insurance help them rebuild their houses, and then continue to collect the mortgage payments. As organizations transition their thinking from a shareholder model to a stakeholder model viewpoint, what we're seeing happen is we're seeing a change in thought where people used to think that doing the right thing and maximizing profit were in conflict with each other, and they're starting to recognize that maybe that's not the case. Okay, so I'm going to give you a great example here with Cortazzo Foods and Family Marinara Sauce. Now, full disclosure, this is my cousin's company, but I'm not trying to give him a plug here. I just think the program he's got going on is really, really awesome and a really great example of what we're talking about here with corporate social responsibility. So Cortazzo is a pretty young company. It's a small regional food company. All right, and my cousin created a program that he calls Everyone to the Table. Okay, and what they did here is they've donated over 17,000 meals. All right, and part of that comes from money that Cortazzo donates. Part of that comes from programs that some of their customers get involved in. So they'll sell like t-shirts that have the Everyone to the Table logo on them, and 100% of the proceeds will go towards the program, and so on and so forth. Okay, now why does he do Everyone to the Table? Well, he does Everyone to the Table because he has a strong belief that eating meals together as a family is important to people's well-being. And aligned with that belief, he says that if people don't have the opportunity to eat, they're not only being denied food, but they're being denied these important social interactions. So that's part of why he began building this program. Well, yes, the program does have some costs associated with it, but it also has brought a lot of great publicity to the company and helped build some identity that people want to be associated with Cortazzo because of the good that they're doing in the community. Similarly, organizations used to look at the environment as a no win situation. It was seen as if we're going to be environmentally friendly, we're going to have to sacrifice some profits. But the reality is that that's changing also. And part of that is because of consumer demand. All right. So organizations need to respond to what it is the consumer wants. And if we look at today's world, many consumers want environmentally friendly vehicles. And Toyota may have been the first one to come out with a mass produced hybrid when they came out with the Prius, but then we've seen several competitors such as Honda and Nissan come out with hybrids of their own. Okay, so through this, these organizations are meeting requests of their customers and suppliers. All right, they're also preparing to comply with guidelines. All right, we're seeing emissions guidelines that are changing and becoming more strict. And these environmentally friendly vehicles are preparing companies to compete in that environment. And for those who are doing this well, they are gaining a competitive advantage. Part of the reason that ethical decision making around the environment can be so difficult for organizations is because we live in what you call a risk society. And what that basically means is the creation and distribution of wealth generates byproducts that can cause damages, cause harm to others. So, some examples of byproducts of production that we have are air pollution, global warming, ozone depletion, acid rain, toxic waste, and nuclear hazards. But as managers look to make more ethical decisions as they pertain to the environment, they can engage in sustainable growth, which focuses on not harming future generations, or they can go one step further and engage in what we call ecocentric management, which actually seeks to improve the quality of life for all stakeholders. Now, we can measure our sustainability or our ecocentricity through something called a life cycle analysis. And what the life cycle analysis does, it basically analyzes the inputs and outputs over the life of a product to determine its environmental impact. So, one example of information that we can get from a life cycle analysis is something called the water footprint. The water footprint tells us how much water it takes to produce different types of food. Did you know that to make a pound of beef, it requires over 1,800 gallons of water? Now, by contrast, a pound of fruit requires about 115 gallons, and vegetables require even less than that. So, when we look at beef and compare it to food and vegetables in terms of water consumption, beef is a much less sustainable product. Now, organizations can take the information that we've been talking about here and use it to set what we would call an environmental agenda. Okay, while some companies have been oblivious to their environmental impact in the past, most companies are becoming very well aware of it, and many are taking steps to improve their environmental impact. So, Google, for example, has claimed to be carbon neutral for several years now, but has set a goal to be carbon free in terms of energy by the year 2030. Ben and Jerry's has also set a similar goal, not quite so ambitious, but they've set the goal to be carbon free by the year 2050. IKEA has also set several goals as an organization, and they're looking at doing things like finding more sustainable forestry and putting more LED lights in their showrooms. Now, the hope here is that if we keep making ethical decisions in terms of the environment, that we can get to a point where we have what's called a circular economy. And in a circular economy, our inputs become our outputs, and our outputs become our future inputs. All right. And as we achieve this goal, we're going to minimize waste, we're going to collaborate, and we're going to regenerate. That's it for this lesson. Thanks so much for joining me here. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you learned something. And this is Billy Obenauer here telling you, let's get ethical, everybody.